Here's the thing. Who's right, the Tories or Labour? Boris Johnson has been urged to give millions of families a helping hand ahead of a Commons vote on extending benefit increases worth £20 a week. Labour will use a debate today to ramp up the pressure on the government to prolong the universal credit uplift. It's worth about £1,000 a year beyond the 31st of March. That's when it was meant to end. It was always going to be a temporary thing. Keir Starmer said families needed certainty. Incomes would be protected, he says. Tory MPs will abstain, meaning the non-binding motion will pass, but ministers will not be committed on implementing it. Work and Pension Secretary Therese Coffey said the government had consistently stepped up to support low-income families and the most vulnerable in society throughout the pandemic and will continue to do so. And there's talk of the Conservatives having a one-off payment of £500. So there's your 500 quid. Do with it what you will, and that will be it. The £20 increase was only ever temporary. And here lies the problem. And I'm so fascinated by this. I'm so fascinated by the benefit system, the welfare system, how it works. How do you find the best? Well, there is no best one, by the way. And it's almost the worst job in the world if you're the Work and Pension Secretary. Whatever country you're in, the Work and Pension Secretary will always get it in the neck for these kind of, along with the Chancellor and the Prime Minister, President, whatever. It's almost impossible to square the circle. It is impossible to square the circle to everybody's satisfaction. However, if ever there was a narrative that was so ripe, so delicious, so irredeemably beautiful for the Labour Party, it is the line that the Tories are taking money away from the poor. I mean, those Labour MPs, when they joined Parliament, when they got elected into their constituents, probably thought those old days of arguing about the Tories taking money from poor folk were well and truly over. And then this comes along. It's an absolute open goal for the Labour Party. It's a peach of an issue. They will be loving every moment of this. And it feeds in to so many aspects of the benefit, the welfare system, how you construct it, who gets it, who's entitled, what is it there to achieve more than anything. And I want to know, in a nutshell, who do you think's right on this one, the Tories or the Labour Party? The Tories are saying, come 31st of March, the temporary £20 increase will disappear, and Labour are saying that should carry on indefinitely. Who's right, Tories or Labour? 0344 499 1000. There's a couple of issues here. Years back, when they introduced the winter fuel allowance, remember the winter fuel allowance? You know, you might have forgotten this. It was only ever meant to be a temporary thing for one particularly cold winter. And Gordon Brown introduced this, and it remained forevermore. And it's been a political football forevermore. Once you introduce it, someone somewhere, you put the word temporary on it, that means somebody somewhere has got to remove it again. That's never going to be a good look. Who's right, the Tories or Labour? Now, the Tories say, as a way of offsetting this, we're going to give every family in this position 500 quid each. That's worth about £3 billion overall. So this is not an insignificant gesture. The question is whether it does the job it's meant to do, because it could never be enough. And we've seen for years the political football that's been played between the parties. And you know what? If you went back over the last 30 years, and seriously, despite all the mood music, you know, Labour are the people that will give you more, and the Tories are the wicked people that will take it away again. You will not find any evidence that will substantially back that up, because you'll discover that more or less, give or take, they spend kind of the same in some areas, and in some occasions the Tories even spend more in this department. It might go in different ways, and it might be taking money from that particular part of the welfare budget, which is absolutely huge, and giving it to another part of the welfare budget. There's winners and there's losers in all of these equations, and there's never going to be universal satisfaction on this one. It's an impossible circle to try and draw. You cannot square it, as it were. 0344 499 1000. And it becomes even trickier when you get into the question as to what welfare is meant to do. Is it meant to lift you out of poverty for good? Is it meant to be a temporary measure? Is it meant to also carry with it a kind of an incentive component so that you will look at it and think, okay, I don't want to be in this position for the rest of my life, so I've got every reason to get out of it. You've got to throw that factor in there as well. And in terms of how much you give, I mean, 20 quid a week. I mean, there's a bit of a myth out there that the world is full of benefit scrounging dodgepots. And of course, there will be some benefit scrounging dodgepots out there. There is in everywhere. Where I grew up. I mean, have I mentioned Bad Back Ray before? Bad Back Ray, who had a perpetual bad back. Bad Back Ray could do all manner of things. I mean, I swear he was an acrobat, this guy. But when it came to the social, the security people, Ray could hardly walk. He was crippled up like a good 'un, was poor old Ray. He walked in there contorted into that office once a fortnight to dob on to get his fortnightly gyro. Poor old Ray, in he'd go. You'd think, shall I help him? Poor man, he walked to the car with his little crutches. Then he was off to the footy at the weekend. He was absolutely fine, Bad Back Ray. And then there was Queenie round the corner. I mean, Queenie, that was a great example, because Queenie had about 17 of her family living in her house. All manner of people. None of them ever worked. I could tell you these anecdotes, and if you've grown up in the same kind of background that I did, then you will hear lots of people tell you those anecdotes. But of course, anecdotes, the plural of anecdote isn't data. But it is datum in some respects. So these are not insignificant, but I don't for 1 second believe that the average person on universal credit is somebody who's having it off royally with your money. You don't earn a great living on benefits. I mean, some people who are on benefits for a long period of time and could do better, may well fall into that category of, well, you could work, but they're also not having it off royally either with your money. There's not enough money in the benefit system. And unless you're somebody who's really worked the system, which would invariably involve criminality, then nobody is going to be having plush Barbados-like holidays on universal credit. It's just not going to happen. Simultaneously, if you throw an extra 20 quid into the pot, you don't serve the long-term problem either. And of course, welfare isn't meant to solve the long-term problem. If it did solve the long-term problem, then it would become a way of earning a living. And that would be silly too. So there's a big old balancing act here. 0344 499 1000. I mean, to me, I heard Julia this morning, who spoke to John Reynolds, the Labour Work and Pensions Minister. They were actually in a curious agreement on quite a lot. Julia didn't think the 500 quid thing was a particularly good idea. She also acknowledged that the £20 issue wasn't going to be a huge game changer. I mean, I'm in slight disagreement with her on the 500 quid thing. I mean, if you throw somebody 500 quid and say, look, this is an emergency amount we're giving you, and do with it what you will, but you will be aware that that's going to run out, and then it's for you to do something about it. You've got to have that component built in to the benefit system, right? You have to have that. Phil in Thurrock says, it's simple. Whatever the total annual cost of the 20 quid, deduct it from MPs and the Lord's daily allowance and pay. You could do that, I suppose. It's a very nice... What do you do the following year and the year after that? What is the answer to this? There's a whole conundrum. Let's widen this out in terms of government's responsibility when it comes to benefits. And there's going to be more of this, by the way, as we move forward. And the economy is not in great shape. And also you get into the other territory of universal basic income, artificial intelligence, taking jobs away. So we're in I think, a curious, really bumpy 10 years when we have to recalibrate our relationship with the welfare system and what it means. And some people do say universal basic income. That's, by many expert standards, dead in the water. But in terms of this specific argument, there was an extra 20 quid a week given to people on universal credit. It was only a temporary measure. It was only meant to last until March the 31st. The Tories are saying we will scrap it on March the 31st, but we'll throw you 500 quid as well to see you through that difference. Labour are saying keep it indefinitely. Who's right, Labour or the Tories? So this is the story, of course, of universal credit. The Prime Minister has been urged to give millions of families a helping hand ahead of the Commons vote on extending that benefit increase. It's worth £20 a week. Labour will use the debate today to ramp up the pressure on the government to keep the universal credit uplift, the £1,000 a year it's worth, beyond the 31st of March. Although it was implemented as a temporary add-on to help those unable to work or struggling due to the lockdown, Labour MPs and anti-poverty campaigners are pleading with the government to keep the support in place, describing it as a lifeline for more than 5.5 million families. But who's right here? The Tories or Labour? In a moment, we'll speak to Jo Michell, Associate Professor of Economics, University of West of England. First Professor of Economics at the University of Buckingham is Professor Len Shackleton. Len, afternoon to you. Who's got this right, Labour or the Tories? Hi.
It's a difficult call, Ian. Obviously, the people are in great difficulty at the moment, and you can understand the feeling that we should continue this help. But the problem is, of course, that we can pay for these kind of one-off periods where while the pandemic goes on. But the danger is that we'll get locked into further spending for the indefinite future. And £6 billion is what this thing will cost per year. One way of looking at that, of course, is to say that that's an extra £200 per head in income taxpayer. It's a tenth of the defence budget. It's about what we spend on childcare. There's all sorts of alternative ways in which we could spend money, and just simply extending a benefit which was only ever intended to be temporary for an indefinite period, I think, is wrong.
So in terms of indefinite, I mean, that's one issue. What about, if Labour were to say, OK, what about another year? I mean, where is this fine line? It's a difficult one.
It's a very difficult one to judge, and it depends, of course, how quickly we manage to come out of the pandemic. And things are looking brighter in the sense that the vaccinations are being rolled out, and we hope that by the summer we'll see something like a return to something close to normality, when I hope the job market will pick up and some of these problems will be relieved. Yeah. Because the major thing, of course, is to get people back into work, not to keep them indefinitely.
Well, indeed. I mean, Jo, let's put this to you. Jo Michell, Associate Professor of Economics at the University of West England. I mean, first question then, who's got this right, Labour or the Tories, Jo? Afternoon.
Good afternoon. It's a straightforward one. On this question, Labour are correct. There is no justification for keeping families in poverty, for keeping families in a situation where they can't feed their children in the midst of the worst pandemic in the last 100 years in the sixth richest country in the world. It is £6 billion, depending on how you measure it. That is absolutely manageable. It can be done indefinitely. It pales in comparison to the sums that have been wasted in what look like corrupt contracts that have gone to politically connected donors, politically connected companies to produce PPE which never appeared and so on. So it's very straightforward that it's an absolute minimum that's needed to prevent terrible destitution and suffering in this country for the next few months.
But why 20 and not 25?
Well, I would like to see 25. I mean, it's the absolute.
That's a never-ending game, isn't it? We could keep that going forever.
You can keep it going forever, but everything has an upper and a lower limit, and we could argue where the level is.
But what's the moral argument for 20 quid is my point.
Well, the moral argument for not taking away £20 at the moment is more of a technical argument in the sense that it's there, why take it away? I would make an argument that we could go further than £20, so I would argue for a higher level. I think there's a moral argument for a higher level, but given that this is the political debate at the moment, I think we should focus on that debate.
But of course, if this was normal times, no COVID, etc., a £20 weekly increase in a single benefit would be huge.
It would, but I think in this country, our benefit system is not fit for purpose, and we need to start making the argument that there should be a strong social safety net. There's no reason. What justification is there for families not being able to feed their children? What justification is there for families not being able to heat their houses? I mean, these are very simple questions, I think, and unless you can say, this is why I propose that we want to keep children in poverty and we want to keep children hungry, I just can't see the counter-argument.
Len Shackleton, I mean, on that point, they're very powerful points that Jo makes there. I mean, if you can't heat your home or feed your kids, then something in society has gone wrong, right?
Yeah, well, of course, this is the line which is often put forward without thinking through just who these people are. And it is not the case that of the 6 million households who get these benefits, that most of them have children. That's just not the case. And there is a separate issue about whether our welfare system is well targeted, and I might agree with Jo that that's not the case. But sort of blanket increases in benefits right across the board are just not the way to go, I think.
What about this £500 that's been suggested, Jo Michell? The 500 quid one-off payment. I mean, it's not the full amount, but you wouldn't suggest that's a government that doesn't like helping. It's worth 3 billion quid.
It sounds to me like a way of putting something which looks immediately relatively generous on the table as a way of getting out of the longer term responsibilities, a way of kind of paying people off so they keep quiet for the longer term. But what I'm still not hearing is an argument why it's bad. I haven't heard a single argument as to what the problem of providing income for families with children or those who rely on benefits without children who at some point
I would
may
imagine
have
in the
children.
grander scale, because it's other people's money, and whilst on this particular point it's a very seductive argument, if you extend that logic, what's wrong with just giving some extra money here, then you could apply that into myriad areas of public spending.
It's a balance, and I think we're a long way along the spectrum of that balance, and we could bring it back a lot further into line with other countries, into historical sort of comparative standards. There's a lot of income in this country. There's a lot of money. There are a lot of people who receive high incomes, and arguably, I would say some of them don't receive incomes that are commensurate to their contribution to society. So I don't have a problem with some redistribution towards those who are genuinely struggling in a very rich country.
And on that point, Len Shackleton, the £500, same question to you. Is that likely to offset something here? I mean, I would imagine it's better than nothing, but is it the right move from Rishi Sunak?
Well, I think it makes more sense than a sort of longer term commitment. I mean, one of the things to focus on here is that we can afford to finance by debt the extraordinary business of the pandemic. But what we don't want to do is bake into our budget system a continuing commitment to pay large amounts of money out in a very undifferentiated way. So, yeah, I mean, if we're talking, is this better than a permanent commitment to pay £20 a week extra? I agree. Maybe that's the way which Rishi Sunak will go.
Len, thank you. And Jo, did you want to come back in on that? Jo, was there a final point you wanted to make?
Yes, I would say that actually undifferentiated payments have a lot in favour. Increasingly, studies show that where you don't means test and you just provide income in a fairly, scattergun, broad brush approach, which may not sound immediately optimal, and then balance that with higher taxation on those who can afford it. Overall incomes, overall outcomes, economic activity, health, you see increases in a whole range of things, and that can actually help to pay for these measures. Better health, better employment, and so on can actually help to pay for the payments in the first place.
Thank you, Jo Michell, who is Associate Professor of Economics, University of West England. The other voice you heard there, Professor Len Shackleton, who's Professor of Economics at the University of Buckingham. Two slightly different views there. Who's right overall on this one, Labour or the Tories? And the wider issue, I think, what is genuinely fascinating about the benefit system as to how what is the yardstick by which you judge how much you give, balanced out with not giving enough, of course, unacceptable. Giving too much, that it becomes a wage, would clearly be stupid. I don't think that happens very often, but you take my point.